on the 12th of July 1817, a thinker was turned loose on this planet. He was called Henry David Thoreau, and Concord, Massachusetts was the place of his birth. Some know of him dimly and inaccurately because he built a hut and lived alone for a while on the shore of Walden Pond. Others, of a political bent, hold him dear because he once refused to pay his taxes and went to jail rather than compromise with his conscience. There are those who remember his name as a naturalist, others as a diarist. Some know him as a traveler, and a few, here and there, cherish his memory as a maker of aphorisms. Perhaps because he was so much of a man in every sense of the word, every genuine man, every sincere thinker who comes across him finds something that strikes a sympathetic chord, and the more a man strives for individuality, the deeper depth he discovers in Thoreau. I came across him when a youth, opened his book Walden at random, and hit on this: let every man mind his own business and endeavor to be what he was made. Then I saw this: if a man does not keep pace with his companions, perhaps it is because he hears a different drummer. Let him step to the music which he hears, however measured or far away. At that, I emptied my pocket and the book became mine. I bought it, as I well remember, in some lecture hall where Edward Carpenter, author of Love's Coming of Age, had spoken on simplification of life, and Carpenter himself, member of an aristocratic and wealthy family, had dropped material possessions to live quietly at a place called Millthorpe, where he raised vegetables and fruits, which he sold in the nearby market. It was a time in my life when I imagined that the mere possession of things made for happiness. I was bitten with the mania of ownership. I was like the old woman in the fairy tale of the golden carp. My blind wants trod on each other's heels. A horse, a bicycle, 3 or 4 suits of clothes, a different tie for each day in the week, a shotgun, a revolver. Then came the introduction to Thoreau's writings, and the philosophical anchorite, the man of austere solitude, gave me a vision of a new heaven and a new earth. New values were created. I learned to measure the worth of things in the amount of life I was asked to pay for them. Was I willing, for instance, to work for an hour for a glass of wine? Would I give the half of a day for a new tie? Was a bicycle worth the months of my life? Looked at in that way, some things seemed absurdly dear, which I had before considered as cheap. Things that had appeared slightly desirable were so no longer. I began to take stock of myself as I had never done before, and so doing saw much in a new light. As for Thoreau, I found him by no means a visionary, but instead an intensely practical fellow. I found, too, that much of what I had learned from costly and sometimes painful experience, Thoreau had learned for me, as it were, and not only that, but had set down the result of his experience for my guidance, had I but the wit to accept. Taking stock of our own lives. Consider this business of stock-taking. It is the plainest road by which to approach Thoreau. For if we do not take stock, how shall we find the root of evil? Says Thoreau, there are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the root. So sensing something of this, every thoughtful man finding things going wrong takes stock of himself now and then. And there are few indeed who cannot recall a kind of round-table consultation during which the head of the family has pointed out the fact that it was costing far too much to live. Then it is that an open door seems to offer, and there are dreams of an early return to the land. 2 years ago, in my own case, living then in the city of Cleveland, I figured that what with the upkeep of 2 automobiles, the odd dollars spent by the boys of the family in ice cream parlors and theaters, the purchase of gifts for their girlfriends, the cost of keeping a daughter at boarding school in another state added to what was lightly referred to on the bills as extras. The amount spent on music, toys, books, picnics, trips, phonograph records, entertainments, charities, and occasional fads, at least 2/3 of my life was going for luxuries. My success was my poverty, and, as Thoreau has it, a man is rich in proportion to the number of things he can afford to let alone. Or again, the problem of life becomes, one cannot say by how many degrees, more complicated as our material wealth is increased, whether that needle that they tell of was a gateway or not, since the problem is not merely nor mainly to get life for our bodies, but by this or a similar discipline to get life for our souls. Life is too complex. So we left the city, bought land in 𝘿𝙬𝙬𝙧𝙮, and made an attempt at simplification of life. We built our own house, tried honestly to do things as far as we were able at first hand, to live close to the earth. Still, as a moment's reflection will show, the mere doing of that solved no big part of the general problem. We found that the simple life was still extremely complex, the life economical very expensive. To take a single instance, that of a family washing day. True, there was no electric light bill to pay, nor was there any costly washing machine to keep in repair, but there were, nevertheless, large expenditures in another way. For if you look into the matter clear-eyed, you will easily visualize the new problems that confronted us. There was wood to be cut from the forest, and when cut, it had to be hauled and chopped. There was a boiler to get and to set up, and on each wash day there was an outside fire to be made and kept going. Water had to be drawn from a well and carried to another place, and as winter came, a wash house had to be built. So, with one thing and another, counting clothes drying and ironing as well as the mere washing, the sum total of distributed labor seemed to aggregate far more than the labor value of my own hours when our washing had been done in the city with modern conveniences. What Thoreau means by simplicity. What I am particularly trying to emphasize at this moment is that Thoreau did not intend that any belief should be entertained that the mere fact of going to the soil, of changing city life for country life, solved any problem whatsoever. You must get that straight. He went far deeper. His philosophy was that with simplicity alone could anything be accomplished. The man on the soil could be, and indeed was, quite as much a slave as the man who never saw or handled a spade. Ponder this passage, which I take from Walden. The farmer is endeavoring to solve the problem of a livelihood by a formula more complicated than the problem itself. To get his shoestrings, he speculated in herds of cattle. With consummate skill, he has set his strap with a hairspring to catch comfort and independence, and then, as he turned away, got his own leg into it. This is the reason he is poor, and for a similar reason, we are all poor in respect to 1,000 savage comforts, though surrounded by luxuries. Then again, in the same book, in the chapter on economy, we find this. I am wont to think that men are not so much the keepers of herds as herds are the keepers of men. The former are so much the freer. Possessions, 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 he seems to say, keep men poor, and possessions hamper a man in the country quite as much as they hamper the city dweller. All of which must not be lost sight of, for it is fundamental, if you would understand the Thoreau philosophy. To emphasize this, I return to my own experience. Other startling things appeared at the end of the year. In the city, we had added up the total of bills received from the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker, the grocer, the dairyman, and pastry cook. Almost it seems sometimes as if all merchants were members of some secret society pledged to wreak my ruin. There was an air of deliberately organized power. So we dreamed of the days when we might gather a basket of eggs, kill our own meat, see standing in a milk house foaming buckets of milk, and gather a garden produce with light-hearted song in the dewy morn of some jocund day. So for a year or more we wrought. At the end of that time we took stock to find that we, being unable to lead the frugal life of a Caliph Omar, had eaten 7 calves, 1 steer, 5 hogs, 8 sheep, uncounted chickens, ducks, and geese, 4,380 eggs, and 10 barrels of apples. In all, more than 6,000 pounds of meat had gone to feed a family of 8. For flesh with us had always been a staple article of diet. Then, too, to feed the creatures we had eaten, there was wagon after wagon load of miscellaneous feed, of hay, bran, shorts, corn chops, and other incidentals, with ton upon ton of feed for the horses that hauled the stuff that plowed the land. Most certainly, then, the simple life looked decidedly complex, and nothing seemed to have been gained by leaving the city. We had, as it seemed, leaped from one mad materialism to another. We had faced new experiences, and we had learned new lessons, but most assuredly, we had found no way out of the cretin labyrinth. Here again, Thoreau is clear and helpful. When men begin to do, not merely unnecessary or artistic, but luxurious and idle work, with their assistance, it is inevitable that a few do all the exchange work with the oxen, or, in other words, become the slaves of the strongest. Man thus not only works for the animal within him, but, for a symbol of this, he works for the animal without him. The result of the experiment. But mark this, to the end that you may the better come to understand the Thoreau philosophy. On the other hand, because of withdrawal from the crowd, because of a less hectic life, there were certain intangibles to our credit. We had had perfect health. We had, one and all, worked with our hands at productive work with real enjoyment. We had known a measure of independence. If the boys and the girls of the family wanted to yell, to play ball, to act like Indians o' Sundays, they did so. For a year they had actually lived in the present. They had become arrogant rather than humble, rash rather than contented. There had been food on the table which they themselves had raised and prepared. In the daily work there had been 1,000 failures, but there had been learned 1,000 lessons. True, there had been many annoyances, but there had been no fall into any slough of despond. The lads stood foursquare and upright. The girls looked out on life with clear-seeing eyes. They had come to know reality. It must be perfectly clear then to you who read that what I expected to find in leaving a city life I did not find. For of diminution of work I found no signs, but rather the reverse. Nor were there idle times for the rest of the family. That which we gained was something added unto us quite unexpected. We had found real pleasure in work. We had a new pride in ourselves. We had found that in our own bosoms were our destinies as stars. The haunting fears which had possessed us, a long catalogue of potential evils, fears that we might go hungry, that we would be lonesome and unhappy, that we might care no more for the finer things that go to make life sweet, that we might grow cloddish. These fears had proven baseless. At first hand, and at a cost, we had learned exactly what Thoreau told us we could not but fail to learn. Pursue, keep on with, circle round and round your life as a dog does his master's chaise. Do what you love, know your own bone, gnaw at it, bury it, unearth it, and gnaw at it still. Aim above morality. Be not simply good, be good for something. All fables indeed have their morals, but the innocent enjoy the story. Let nothing come between you and the light. Respect men as brothers only. When you travel to the celestial city, carry no letter of introduction. When you knock, ask to see God, none of the servants. In what concerns you much, do not think that you have companions. Know that you are alone in the world. And again, if a man were to place himself in an attitude to bear manfully the greatest evil that can be inflicted upon him, he would find suddenly that there was no such evil to bear. His brave back would go a-begging. There are two books which show the intense practicality of Thoreau. One is made up of his epigrams and the other is his essay on walking. No one can read them and damn Thoreau as a mere theorist. Nor was he by any means a word spinner. His life and his surroundings were one grand whole, and, like Nietzsche, he summed up an experience in few but pregnant words. He was brief because he had too much to say to be lengthy. He was the great American proverb maker because he was the great American thinker, the really practical man. Consider this. There is a sermon in each and every one of them. Cows in the pasture are good milkers. You can imagine him commenting thus upon some gilded proposition, some advertisement promising untold wealth as the result of an investment. You cannot travel 4 roads at once. That was said to a hesitating man, A man like how many of our modern politicians who try to carry water on both shoulders at once, a man trying to darken counsel by words without meaning, a man trying to run with the hare and hunt with the hounds. If you wish the meat, crack the nut. If it does not happen soon, it will late. Take time as it comes, people for what they are worth, and money for what it will buy. No fish, fresh or salt, when a fool holds the line. Sleep is half a dinner. Cocks crow as fortune brightens. A fool is always starting. At a small spring you can drink at your ease. Long talk and little time. Better days, a bankrupt's purchase. A wit sleeps in the middle of a narrow bed. A trout in the milk is circumstantial evidence. What men do, not what they promise. Such are the utterances of a free and healthy man, living and looking for social and natural responses, getting down to the bare bones of things. In a way, to be sure, they bear the impress of egotism, but it is because his action differed from the action of the mass. He did not keep step with his companions because he heard a different drummer. If he passed over some things that others insist upon, it was because his time and means were fully occupied with other matters, or, as he expressed it, his capital was invested elsewhere. He was direct because he had no time to be otherwise. As with the word, so with the deed. Because his only ornament, a paper weight, needed dusting, he flung it out of the window. It did not pay for its keep. A lady friend offered him a mat for his house, and he refused it because he could, just as well, wipe his shoes on the grass at his door-sill. At dinner, being asked which dish he preferred, he replied, the nearest. To him came on a visit 3 reformers who talked about moral endeavor. He turned on his heel and left them talking and set down in his diary his resentment of their cant and familiar greasy kindness. He sees a bunch of violets in a glass vase tied loosely with a straw, and the sight, he says, reminds me of myself. So he frames a little poem, and its very rhythm is as the man himself. I am a parcel of vain strivings tied, by chance bond together, dangling this way and that. Their links were made so loose and wide, methinks, for milder weather. A bunch of violets without their roots, a sorrow intermixed, encircled by a wisp of straw, once coiled about their shoots, the law by which I'm fixed. A nosegay which time clutched from out those fair Elysian fields, with weeds and broken stems in haste, doth make the rabble rout, that waste, the day he yields. And here I bloom for a short hour unseen, drinking my juices up, with no root in the land to keep my branches green, but stand in a bare cup. Some tender buds were left upon my stem in mimicry of life, but the children will not know, till time has withered them, the woe with which they're rife. But now I see I was not plucked for naught, and after, in life's vase, of glass set while I might survive, but by a kind hand brought alive to a strange place. The stock thus thinned will soon redeem its hours, and by another year, such as God knows, with freer air, more fruit, and fairer flowers, will bear while I droop here. You cannot fail to see directness in that. It is the straight line that attracted Thoreau. Not for him at any time the labyrinth. Not for him the imagery that repel men who, trained in affairs, find in poetry something vexatious and are honest enough to say so. To many such I have handed Thoreau's poem, The Black Knight, and in each and every case there has been the same remark. That's the kind of thing I understand. Here it is. Be sure your fate doth keep apart its state, not linked with any band, even the nobles of the land. In tented fields with cloth of gold, no place doth hold, but is more chivalrous than they are, and sigheth for a nobler war. A finer strain its trumpet sings, a brighter gleam its armor flings. The life that I aspired to live, no man proposeth me. Only the promise of my heart wears its emblazonry. And once more, as final example, I cite this poem, Prayer. Great God, I ask thee for no meaner pelf than that I may not disappoint myself, that in my conduct I may soar as high as I can now discern with this clear eye, and next in value which thy kindness lends, that I may greatly disappoint my friends, however they think or hope that it may be, they may not dream how thou'st distinguished me, that my weak hand may equal my firm faith, and my life practice more than my tongue saith, that my conduct may not show, nor my relenting lines, that I thy purpose did not know, or overrated thy designs. Obviously, a man so concise and frank as he, a man praying that he may disappoint his friends, would hardly be gracious, and with him undue familiarity would certainly be impossible. Nor could such a man fail to act upon his convictions at any and every time. There was an entirely typical incident of his refusal to pay his taxes. When the government acquiesced in the Mexican War, Thoreau considered that it had violated its foundation stone of liberty. He heartily approved when his friend Bronson Alcott refused to pay his taxes and promptly followed suit, declining to give the government $1 which might buy a bullet to kill a man he never saw. Then, one afternoon, near the end of the first summer, when I went to the village to get a shoe from the cobbler's, I was seized and put in jail, because, as I have elsewhere narrated, I did not pay a tax to, or recognize the authority of, the state which buys and sells men, women, and children like cattle at the door of the state house. Elsewhere, in the essay on civil disobedience, he says, I felt as if I alone of all my townsmen had paid my tax. They plainly did not know how to treat me, but behaved like persons who are underbred. In every threat and in every compliment there was a blunder, for they thought that my chief desire was to stand on the other side of that stone wall. I could not but smile to see how industriously they locked the door on my meditations, which followed them out again without let or hindrance, and they were really all that were dangerous.
Emerson meets Thoreau in jail. To him in jail came Emerson, who asked, Henry, why are you here? Why are you not here? Was the answer, and certainly calmer and more judicial counter-question never was put, for Emerson, equally with Thoreau, had opposed war and slavery in word as well as in thought, but, unlike the Walden man, was unwilling to show his opposition in deed. But Thoreau was all for justice and self-assertion in deed as well as in word. In his earnestness, his utter sincerity, he went to lengths to which we could not reach today, to heights to which few of us dare. He said things which in these days might have landed him in a jail from which he could not easily be freed, into complications which would become almost inextricable entanglements. Let each inhabitant of the state dissolve his union with her as long as she delays to do her duty, he says in Slavery in Massachusetts. And again in the same essay, unfortunately too little known, will mankind never learn that policy is not morality, that it never considers any moral right, but considers merely what is expedient, chooses the available candidate, who is invariably the devil, and what right has his constituents to be surprised, because the devil does not behave like an angel of light? What is wanted is men, not of policy, but of probity, who recognize a higher law than the Constitution or the decision of the majority. The fate of the country does not depend on how you vote at the polls. The worst man is as strong as the best at that game. It does not depend on what kind of paper you drop into the ballot box once a year, but on what kind of man you drop from your chamber into the street every morning. Now perhaps you begin to see the true Thoreau, the man who burned with indignation at injustice, the man not afraid to speak his inmost thought, the unterrified Jeffersonian Democrat. For, mind you, there are those who have tried to emasculate Thoreau, who have painted him not as he was, but as they would have others believe him to have been. Thoreau himself was no mealy-mouthed reformer. He was a man proclaiming for individualism, for his rights to be, to think, to say. His words are incandescent. Ponder these. If there is any hell more unprincipled than our rulers, and we, the ruled, I feel curious to see it. Slavery in Massachusetts. And this, the only government that I recognize, and it matters not how few are at the head of it or how small its army, is that power that establishes justice in the land, never that which establishes injustice. What shall we think of a government to which all the truly brave and just men in the land are enemies, standing between it and those whom it possesses? A government that pretends to be Christian and crucifies 1,000,000 Christs every day. A plea for John Brown. Nor has Carlyle himself been more scathing. When a government puts forth its strength on the side of injustice, as ours, to maintain slavery and kill the liberators of the slave, it reveals itself a merely brute force, or worse, a demoniacal force. It is the head of the plug uglies. It is more manifest than ever that tyranny rules. I see this government to be effectually allied with France and Austria in repressing mankind. There sits a tyrant holding fettered 4 millions of slaves. Here comes their heroic liberator. This most hypocritical and diabolical government looks up from its seat on the gasping 4 millions and inquires, with an assumption of innocence, "What do you assault me for? Am I not an honest man? Cease agitation on this subject, or I will make a slave of you too, or else hang you." We talk about a representative government, but what a monster of a government is that where the noblest faculties of the mind and the whole heart are not represented. A semi-human tiger or ox stalking over the earth with its heart taken out and the top of its brain shot away. Heroes have fought well on their stumps when their legs were shot off, but I never heard of any good done by such a government as that. A plea for Captain John Brown. Thoreau's opinion of government. He is crescendo in his scorn. He knows no prudence except it be the prudence that makes him beware lest he fail to keep faith with himself, his inner soul. Treason. Where does such treason take its rise? I cannot help thinking of you as you deserve, ye governments. Can you dry up the fountain of thought? High treason, when it is resistance to tyranny here below, has its origin in, and is first committed by, the power that makes and forever recreates man. When you have caught and hung all these human rebels, you have accomplished nothing but your own guilt, for you have not struck at the fountain head. A plea for Captain John Brown. Examine these extracts with some care, and you will discover not an idle theorist, but an intensely practical man. In his day as in ours, there was a world full of disconnected efforts. Then as now, there were moral wastes and maladies in it. Selfishness was in full career from side to side, and a babble of nostrums were dined into 1,000,000 ears, each a different specific. Good man and bad man were vehemently working out cross purposes and utterly discordant projects. In the midst of it all, Thoreau sounded the clear practical note. Each and every man must strike out a plain life. He must master circumstances as well as himself. Then there must be a further insistence that the state does not infringe on the rights of the individual. There will never be a really free and enlightened state until the state comes to recognize the individual as a higher and independent power, from which all its own power and authority are derived, and treats him accordingly. Civil disobedience. Or showing his kinship with the philosopher of the Kropotkin school of thought, mark this from the same essay. The progress from an absolute to limited monarchy, from a limited monarchy to democracy, is a progress towards a true respect for the individual. Called upon men to disobey. With no uncertain tone, he called upon men to revolt against injustice, to disobey under the pressure of unjust laws. Unjust laws exist. Shall we be content to obey them? Or shall we endeavor to amend them, and obey them until we have succeeded? Or shall we transgress them at once? Men generally, under such a government as this, think that they ought to wait until they have persuaded the majority to alter them. They think that if they should resist, the remedy would be worse than the evil. But it is the fault of the government itself that the remedy is evil. It makes it worse. Why is it not more apt to anticipate and provide for reform? Why does it not cherish its wise minority? Why does it cry and resist before it is hurt? Why does it not encourage its citizens to be on the alert, to point out its faults, and do better than it would have them? Why does it always crucify Christ and excommunicate Copernicus and Luther and pronounce Washington and Franklin rebels? Civil disobedience. He says later in the same essay, "I please myself with imagining a state at last which can afford to be just to all men, and to treat the individual with respect as a neighbor, which even would not think it inconsistent with its own repose if a few were to live aloof from it, not meddling with it, nor embraced by it, who fulfilled all the duties of neighbors and fellow men." It seems to me that we touch a kind of prophet as well as a practical guide. He is blood brother to Carlyle, who holds that the idea of duty, the higher religious spirit, self-government, an austere conscience, these alone can reform a corrupt society. The Walden Experiment. There comes a time in the life of every thoughtful man, just as it came in the life of Christ and Buddha and Mahomet, when there is felt the desire to go apart from the noise of the world and its affairs. Man must be still for a while, just as the seed in the earth is still and quiet, in order that it fructify. A Cunningham Graham meditates in the quiet of Arabia, and a Morley finds himself on the lonely plains of Texas. Beethoven fled to the forest, and Bunyan found quiet in jail to make his masterpiece. I have met a man, a well-educated and cultured Englishman, living alone at the foot of the Andes in order that he might have time and opportunity for philosophic meditation. In the day in which Thoreau lived, the spread of Fourierism had led to the establishment of phalansteries. There were attempts to form little social backwaters in which everyone should labor with his hands and endeavor to revert, as much as possible, from an artificial to a simple mode of living. It is typical of the 𝙃𝙘𝙧𝙬 that Emerson wrote to Carlyle in 1840, "We are all a little wild with numberless projects of social reform. Not a reading man but has a draft of a new community in his waistcoat pocket." Thoreau paid a visit to Fruitlands, the colony established by Alcott, but he wrote in his journal, "As for these communities, I think I had rather keep bachelor's hall in hell than go to board in heaven." So in the year 1845, when he was in his 28th year, he determined to transact some private business with the fewest obstacles, as he put it, and, having decided upon Walden Pond as a suitable location, set about building himself a hut. It is nonsense to believe for a single instant that Thoreau was desirous of proving to himself and others that a man could be as independent of mankind as the nest-building bird, as the article in the 9th edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica has it. Professor Nichol repeats the same error in his American Literature, and James Russell Lowell was equally stupid when he wrote regarding Thoreau that his shanty life was a mere impossibility so far as his own conception of it goes, as an entire independency of mankind. The tub of Diogenes had a sounder bottom. Why he went to the woods. Lowell's, like Stevenson's, was a misapprehension based on careless reading. Thoreau's idea was plainly stated. He wished to reduce life to its simplest terms, to have labor in his right hand and its rewards in his left, to be in a position to discard things that he did not think worth the time and trouble of production. In his own words, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. I did not wish to live what was not life. Living is so dear. Nor did I wish to practice resignation unless it was quite necessary. I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life, to live so sturdily and Spartan-like as to put to rout all that was not life, to cut a broad swath and shave close, to drive life into a corner and reduce it to its lowest terms. And if it proved to be mean, why then to get the whole and genuine meanness of it, and publish its meanness to the world. Or if it were sublime, to know it by experience, and be able to give a true account of it in my next excursion." The experiment has been made altogether too much fuss of. As a mere trick of getting along for a few years, of passing the time, it is nothing extraordinary. Any man can live alone and can make a living at first hand. Bitten by the Thoreau philosophy as a youth, I lived alone on an island for more than a year. I find, by reference to a diary, that I lived on very little and, for the most part, caught wild creatures with my bare hands. To do without the company of men and women for a space was not so very difficult. Anyone could do the like. Indeed, for the matter of that, there are in cities hundreds and thousands of the submerged who live very isolated lives, and if they do not do without the rest of mankind, it is safe to say that the rest of mankind does or could do without them very easily. But what really matters is what comes out of such an experiment, what thoughts arrive, what philosophy of life frames itself. In the case of Thoreau, he found that at the end of his experiment, he was no longer the parcel of vain strivings tied, by chance, bond together. Thoreau then borrowed an axe, went into the woods, cut down pine trees, and hewed his logs into shape. He worked leisurely so as to get the full enjoyment of his occupation, and the job took almost 3 weeks. He then dug his cellar 6 feet square by 7 deep, bought the planks that formed the walls of a shanty of a section hand on the Fitchburg Railroad, and carried them on his own back to the site of his house. In May, having all framed and in readiness, for the sake of the neighborliness, he allowed his friends to help in the raising of the frame. So, on the 4th of July, Thoreau took up his residence in the house built with his own hands, a house that had cost $28 in the building. It was 10 feet by 15, had one side window and an end door, opposite which was a brick fireplace. Would not be burdened with things. Naturally, the practical man who, in an outburst of pitying wonder at the spectacle of men enslaved by their own chattels, said, "Furniture, thank God I can sit and I can stand without the aid of a furniture warehouse," would not be overburdened with things. So he had a bed, a table, a little desk, 3 chairs, a looking glass 3 inches in diameter, a pair of tongs and andirons, a kettle, a skillet, a frying pan, a dipper, a wash bowl, 2 knives and forks, 3 plates, 1 cup, 1 spoon, a jug for oil, another for molasses, and a tin lamp. Thus the burden of housework was reduced to a minimum. What he sought, first of all, was a measure of freedom, and that involved a higher economy. In Walden he wrote, "I think that man is at a dead set who has got through a knothole or a gateway where his sledge-load of furniture cannot follow him. I cannot but feel compassion when I hear some trim, compact-looking man, seemingly free, all girded and ready, speak of his furniture, as whether it is insured or not. But what shall I do with my furniture? My gay butterfly is entangled in a spider's web then. Even those who seem for a long while not to have any, if you inquire more narrowly, you will find have some stored in somebody's barn. I look upon England today as an old gentleman who is traveling with a great deal of baggage, trumpery which has accumulated with long housekeeping, which he has not the courage to burn. Great trunk, little trunk, band, box, and bundle. Throw away the first 3 at least. It would surpass the powers of a well man nowadays to take up his bed and walk, and I should certainly advise a sick one to lay down his bed and run. When I have met an immigrant tottering under a bundle which contained his all, looking like an enormous wen which has grown out of the nape of his neck, I have pitied him, not because that was his all, but because he had all that to carry. If I have got to drag my trap, I will take care that it be a light one, and do not nip me in a vital part. But perchance it would be wiser never to put one's paw into it. I would observe, by the way, that it costs me nothing for curtains, for I have no gazers to shut out but the sun and moon, and I am willing that they should look in. The moon will not sour milk or taint meat of mine, nor will the sun injure my furniture nor fade my carpet. And if he is sometimes too warm a friend, I find it still better economy to retreat behind some curtain which nature has provided than to add a single item to the details of housekeeping. A lady once offered me a mat, but as I had no room to spare within or without to shake it, I declined it, preferring to wipe my feet on the sod before my door. It is best to avoid the beginnings of evil. Thoreau's housework. What little housework had perforce to be done became a pleasant pastime. When my floor was dirty, I rose early, and setting all my furnitures out of doors on the grass, bed and bedstand making but one budget, dashed water on the floor and sprinkled white sand from the pond on it, and then with broom scrubbed it clean and white. And by the time the villagers had broken their fast, the morning sun had dried my house sufficiently to allow me to move in again, and my meditations were almost uninterrupted. It was pleasant to see my whole household effects on the grass, making a pile like a gypsy's pack, and my 3-legged table, from which I did not remove the books and pen and ink, standing amid the pine and hickories. Thoreau then lived alone, not to show his independence, not in any sense to defy the rest of mankind, but to live for a time an untrammeled life, to gain a measure of freedom, to look at things and to see them with an unjaded eye. I think that he had this in mind when he wrote his poem Inspiration, in which is the stanza, I hearing get, who had but ears, and sight, who had but eyes before. I moments live, who lived but years, and truth discern, who knew but learning's lore. Was no wild-eyed reformer. You will have seen by now that Thoreau was no fanatic, no wild-eyed reformer, calling on the world to forsake its ways and live in isolated cabins. He was, indeed, nothing more than a whole-souled man searching for the kingdom of heaven that lay within him. He was not the kind of man who would become pontifical or try, under any circumstances, to impose his ideas upon others. He seldom used meat or wine, tea or coffee, and his diet, while at Walden, consisted of rice, cornmeal, beans, and potatoes, but he was no fool to go preaching to others, magnifying trifles of diet into an appearance of supreme importance. Neither was he an austere anchorite frowning on the human race. I looked through the dozen of his books on my shelves to find odd and friendly references to men met and enjoyed, a drunken Dutchman on a New York steamboat, a hard-headed Yankee farmer, an aged brown-coated fisherman who haunted the banks of the 𝙃𝙚𝙤𝙧𝙮, a hardy woodchopper who stayed with him for a time at Walden, the gang of village children he took on a huckleberry expedition when he was released from jail. He could play the flute, sing a good song, dance a breakdown, or perform odd conjuring tricks. He could be friends with man and enjoy human society, or he could be equally happy alone. Monsieur de Conway tells how once Thoreau thrust his hands into the water and brought forth a large bright fish which lay as contented in his hand as if they were old acquaintances. Of course, doubters may as well be told that that kind of thing would not be done with any fish, but it is quite possible with the bream, a fish very given to guarding its nest. Of that fish, Thoreau wrote in the Week on the Concord, I have stood over them half an hour at a time and stroked them familiarly without frightening them, and have even taken them gently out of the water with my hand. Hut was center of gay animal life. As might be expected, Thoreau's hut was the center of a gay animal life. Birds flit fearlessly through the room. Squirrels played on the roof. Moles and hares spent the winter in the cellar. Chickadees perched on the armfuls of wood which he carried across his threshold. A squirrel, which he had taken home so that he might observe its habits, refused its freedom later and became a permanent member of the household, and once, as he tells us, as he was hoeing in the garden, a sparrow alighted on his shoulder, which he regarded as a greater honor than any epaulet he could have won. For him, as for the unspoiled child, each day and each hour of the day had a new delight. The habits of the birds and animals, the tracks of the fox and the otter, the design of the various nests, the shapes and color of the leaves, all these fascinated him. So exactly did he observe things that he believed it possible to tell the very day of the month from an observation of this flower or that shrub. I have said that Thoreau had no notion whatever of trying any experiment for the benefit of mankind. Because he wished to philosophize was no reason that the habit of philosophy should be thrust upon a nation. Because he chose a policy of fine renunciation, there was no reason that the similar policy should be thrust upon others. Thoreau was quite simple and untheatrical in what he did. He was, in short, a private citizen attending strictly to his own business. In the passage that follows, you will see the splendid plainness of the man. It is copied from his book Walden, page 87, edition 1902, Houghton, Mifflin & Company. Before I finished my house, wishing to earn $10 or $12 by some honest and agreeable method, in order to meet my unusual expenses, I planted about 2.5 acres of light sandy soil near it, chiefly with beans, but also a small part with potatoes, corn, peas, and turnips. The whole lot contained 11 acres, mostly grown up to pines and hickories, and was sold the preceding season for $8.08 an acre. One farmer said that it was good for nothing but to raise cheeping squirrels on. I put no manure whatever on this land, not being the owner, but merely a squatter, and not expecting to cultivate so much again, and I did not quite hoe it all at once. I got out several cords of stumps in plowing, which supplied me with fuel for a long time, and left small circles of virgin mold, easily distinguishable through the summer by the greater luxuriances of the beams there. The dead and, for the most part, unmerchantable wood behind my house, and the driftwood from the pond, have supplied the remainder of my fuel. I was obliged to hire a team and a man for the plowing, though I held the plow myself. My farm outgoes for the first season were, for implement, seed, work, etc., $14.72.5. The seed corn was given me. This never costs anything to speak of unless you plant more than enough. I got 12 bushels of beans and 18 bushels of potatoes, besides some peas and sweet corn. The yellow corn and turnips were too late to come to anything. My whole income for the farm was $23.44. Deducting the outgoes, $40.72.5, there are left $8.71.5. Beside produce consumed and that on hand at the time, this estimate was made of the value of $4.50, the amount on hand much more than balancing a little grass which I did not raise. All things considered, I believe that was doing better than any farmer in Concord did that year. The next year I did better still, for I spaded up all the land which I required, about 2/3 of an acre, and I learned from the experience of both years, not being in the least awed by many celebrated works on husbandry, Arthur Young among the rest, that if one would live simply and eat only the crop which he raised, and raise no more than he ate, and not exchange it for any insufficient quantity of more luxurious and expensive things, he would need to cultivate only a few rods of ground, and that it would be cheaper to spade up than that to use oxen to plow it, and to select a fresh spot from time to time than to manure the old, and he could do all this necessary farm work, as it were, with his left hand at odd hours in the summer. And thus he would not be tied to an ox, or horse, or cow, or pig, as at present. I desire to speak impartially on this point, and as one not interested in the success or failure of the present economical and social arrangement. I was more independent than any farmer in Concord, for I was not anchored to a house or farm, but could follow the bent of my genius, which is a very crooked one, every moment. Beside being better off than they already, if my house had been burned, or my crops failed, I should have been nearly as well off as before. Thoreau's earnings. In the same chapter of the book from which that is taken, there is a kind of stock-taking of things material. You will bear in mind that his philosophy, a man is rich in proportion to the number of things which he can afford to let alone, and with that light the survey is illuminating. Here it is. By surveying, carpentry, and day labor of various other kinds in the village in the meanwhile, for I have as many trades as fingers, I earned $13.34. The expense of food for 8 months, from July 4 to March 1, the time when these estimates were made, though I lived there more than 2 years, not counting potatoes, a little green corn, and some peas which I had raised, nor considering the value of what was on hand at the last date, was rice, $1.73.5, molasses, $1.73, rye meal, $1.04 3/4, Indian meal, 99 cents 3/4, pork, 22 cents, flour, 88 cents, sugar, 80 cents, lard, 65 cents, dried apples, 25 cents, sweet potatoes, 10 cents, 1 pumpkin, 6 cents, 1 watermelon, 2 cents, salt, 3 cents. Yes, I did eat $8.74 all told, but I should not thus unblushingly publish my guilt if I did not know that most of my readers were equally guilty with myself, and that their deeds would look no better in print. The next year I sometimes caught a mess of fish for my dinner, and once I went so far as to slaughter a woodchuck which ravaged my bean field, effect his transmigration, as a Tartar would say, and devour him, partly for experiment's sake. But though it afforded me a momentary enjoyment, notwithstanding a musky flavor, I saw that the longest use would not make that a good practice, however it might seem to have your woodchucks ready dressed by the village butcher. Clothing and some incidental expenses within the same dates, though little can be referred from this item, amounted to $8.40 3/4, oil and household utensils $2, so that all the pecuniary outgoes, expecting for washing and mending, which for the most part were done out of the house, and their bills not yet received. And these are all, and more than all, the ways by which money necessarily goes out in this part of the world, were house, $28.12.5, farm, 1 year, $14.72.5, food, 8 months, $8.74, clothing, etc., 8 months, $8.40 3/4, oil, etc., 8 months, $2. In all, $61.99 3/4. I address myself now to those of my readers who have a living to get. And to meet this, I have had farm produce sold $28.44, earned by day labor $13.34, in all $36.78, which, subtracted from the sum of the outgoes, leaves a balance of $25.21 3/4 on the one side, this being very nearly the means with which I started, and the measure of expenses to be incurred. Add on the other, beside the leisure and independence and health thus occurred, a comfortable house for me as long as I choose to occupy it. In that, you have summed up the material aspects of the Walden experiment. You can picture him, a kind of cast-iron man, as Hawthorne styled him, well-built but not tall, with nose strongly aquiline and a habit of active earnestness about him. Meeting him, you might mistake him for a peddler or, perhaps, a sturdy tramp. His ill-shapen clothes, his battered hat, his corduroy trousers, and rough shoes would not form happy exteriors. For other facts in his life, a little-known letter written in answer to a circular issued from Harvard in 1847 for the purpose of collecting data regarding the class of 1837 is useful. In highly characteristic manner it runs, "I am not married. I don't know whether mine is a profession or a trade, or what not. It is not yet learned, and every instance has been practiced before being studied. The mercantile part of it was begun by myself alone. It is not one, but legion. I will give you some of the monster's heads. I am a schoolmaster, a private tutor, a surveyor, a gardener, a farmer, a painter, a house painter, a carpenter, a mason, a day laborer, a pencil maker, a glass paper maker, a writer, and sometimes a poetaster. If you will act the part of Iolaus and apply a hot iron to any of these heads, I shall be greatly obliged to you. My present employment is to answer such orders as may be expected from so general an advertisement as the above, that is, if I see fit, which is not always the case, for I have found out a way to live without what is commonly called employment or industry, attractive or otherwise. Indeed, my steadiest employment, if such it can be called, is to keep myself at the top of earth. The last 2 or 3 years I lived in Concord Woods, alone, something more than a mile from any neighbor, in a house built entirely by myself. P.S. I beg that the class will not consider me an object of charity, and if any of them are in want of any pecuniary assistance and will make known their case to me, I will engage to give them some advice of more worth than money. The gist of that is, of course, the postscript. So, too, in the book Walden, we turn for real value not to the mere record of his economics, interesting though they may be, but to the pages in which is the advice of more worth than money. The mere table of dollars and cents sinks into insignificance compared with this. For more than 5 years, I maintained myself thus solely by the labor of my hands, and I found that by working about 6 weeks in the year, I could meet all the expenses of living. The whole of my winters, as well as most of my summers, I had free for study. I have thoroughly tried school-keeping, and found that my expenses were in proportion to my income, for I was obliged to dress and train, not to say think and believe, accordingly, and I lost my time into the bargain. As I did not teach for the good of my fellow man, but simply for livelihood, this was a failure. I have tried trade, but I found that it would take 10 years to get under way in that, and that then I should be probably on my way to the devil. I was actually afraid that I might by that time be doing what is called a good business. As I preferred some things to others, and especially valued my freedom, as I could fare hard and yet succeed well,
I did not wish to spend my time in earning rich carpets or other fine furniture or delicate cookery or a house in the Grecian or Gothic style just yet. In short, I am convinced, both by faith and experience, that to maintain oneself on this earth is not a hardship, but a pastime, if we will live simply and wisely, as the pursuits of the simpler nations are still the sports of the more artificial. It is not necessary that a man should earn his living by the sweat of his brow, unless he sweats easier than I do. Preserves his freedom and leisure. In other words, Thoreau says what so many of us have thought, that for what we could have, we must exchange life, so many hours, or days, or months, or years for this, that, and the other. And as man wants and works to supply his wants, so his wants increase. And as his wants increase, so is his life expanded in gratifying never-ending desires. Says Thoreau, "The cost of a thing is the amount of what I will call life which is required to be exchanged for it, immediately or in the long run." There you have it in a nutshell. Thoreau chokes off all desires save the desire to have his freedom and his leisure. Thoreau and Swift were diametrically opposed on one point. Swift held that to deprive ourselves of things, to prohibit our everlasting wants, was somewhat like cutting off our feet because we needed shoes. Thoreau decided to want nothing, to limit his desires everywhere. His answer to Swift would have been to the effect that man should learn to go barefoot. He would resist the beginning of things, knowing that it is the first step that counts. So, considering the question of the house, in one place in Walden, he speculates upon the idea of having a kind of box in which to hide on inclement nights and dispensing with the structure altogether. As he argues, it is as every man argues, let a man once indulge in any one case, and a chain is set up to which there is no end. The whole horizon of aspiration may be filled with the notion of owning a house. House seems synonymous with happiness. The home may be gained, but immediately there is a new horizon. The house has fallen into place as a matter of course, which the man accepts as such and thinks no more of. His mental horizon is occupied with other objects: furniture, flower gardens, lawnmowers, sprinkling outfits, porch seats, player pianos, phonographs, books. Thoreau would have man, first of all, attend to himself. While civilization has been improving our houses, it has not equally improved the men who are to inhabit them. Again, if the civilized man's pursuits are no worthier than the savage's, if he has employed the greater part of his life in obtaining gross necessities and comforts merely, why should he have a better dwelling than the former? Of course, the truth is that most men are incapable of such astounding feats of self-privation. In fact, we of today have almost made a creed that all asceticism, all privation, is in itself an unmitigated evil, and that a nobler life will result from generations of self-satisfied rather than repressed animal desires, once they are the lot not of this class or that, but of all. The mania to possess things. But hear Thoreau. He is no moral mountebank. For him, the mania to possess things, to value man by the amount of his possessions, is detestable idolatry. Men will not be men, he holds, until they have learned to do without things, to adopt a rigid economy, a stern and more than Spartan simplicity of life and elevation of purpose. He says, "Our lives are frittered away by detail. An honest man has hardly need to count more than his 10 fingers, or in extreme cases, he may add his 10 toes and lump the rest. Simplicity, simplicity, simplicity. I say, let your affairs be as 2 or 3, and not 100 or 1,000. Instead of 1,000,000, count half a dozen, and keep your accounts on your thumbnail." In the midst of this chopping sea of civilized life, such are the clouds and storms and quicksands and 1,001 items to be allowed for, that a man has to live if he would not founder and go to the bottom and not make his part at all, by dead reckoning. And he must be a great calculator indeed who succeeds. Simplify, simplify. Instead of 3 meals a day, if it be necessary, eat but 1. Instead of 100 dishes, 5, and reduce other things in proportion. Again,
in a passage that might have been written by Carlyle, is this: "Why should we live with such hurry and waste of life? We are determined to be starved before we are hungry. Men say that a stitch in time saves 9, and so they take 1,000 stitches today to save 9 tomorrow. As for work, we haven't any of consequence. We have the St. Vitus dance, and cannot possibly keep our heads still. If I should only give a few pulls at the parish bell rope, as for a fire, that is, without setting the bell, there is hardly a man on his farm in the outskirts of Concord, notwithstanding the press of engagements, which was his excuse so many times this morning, nor a boy nor a woman, I might almost say, but would forsake all and follow that sound, not mainly to save property from the flames, but, if we will confess the truth, much more to see it burn, since burn it must, and we, be it known, did not set it on fire, or to see it put out, and have a hand in it, that is done as handsomely. Yes, even if it were the parish church itself. Hardly a man takes a half-hour's nap after dinner, but when he wakes, he holds up his head and asks, 'What's the news?' as if the rest of mankind had stood as sentinels." Nietzsche, whose aim was that man should learn to transcend morality, to substitute virtue and a man's own inherent nature for conformity and hypocrisy, might have understood Thoreau. We discourse freely without shame of one form of sensuality, and are silent about another. We are so degraded that we cannot speak simply of the necessary functions of human nature. In earlier ages, in some countries, every function was reverently spoken of and regulated by law. Nothing was too trivial for the Hindu lawgiver, however offensive it may be to modern taste. He teaches how to eat, drink, cohabit, void excrement and urine, and the like, elevating what is mean, and does not falsely excuse himself by calling these things trifles. Thoreau as traveler. Many a man has gone twice around the world, and yet seen less than Thoreau saw in his week on the Concord and Merrimack rivers, though the world traveler may have filled many more printed pages. I open my copy of the book, which is divided into 7 parts, one for each day of the week, to find underscorings and marginal notes on each and every page. The volume itself I keep on the shelf standing shoulder to shoulder with Darwin's naturalist's voyage round the world, for like Darwin, Thoreau's writings have indescribable freshness and enthusiasm. In this book, The Week, he addresses the general reader and not the specialist, writes in an admirably lucid, unpretentious style, and is always interesting. I know of no journal of scientific travel quite as entertaining. He has admirable powers and felicity of expression. It is quite as true of him as it was of Huxley that the guiding principle in his life was the deep conviction that knowledge was meant not for men of science alone, but for all the world, and that, not in respect to its material benefits only, but also and even more for its intellectual good. First, in regard to what I called above the unpretentious style. How many of you who read this have sat down, pen in hand, full of intent to write something, and, at the very start, before a word was on the page, given up the task in despair, not knowing how to commence? I call your attention to the opening paragraph of the little voyage. It is unique. At length, on Saturday, the last day of August, 1839, we too, brothers and natives of Concord, weighed anchor in this river port. For Concord, too, lies under the sun, a port of entry and departure for the bodies as well as the souls of men. One shore at least exempted from all duties, but such as an honest man will gladly discharge. A warm, drizzling rain had obscured the morning, and threatened to delay our voyage, but at length the leaves and grass were dried, and it came out a mild afternoon, as serene and fresh as if nature were maturing some greater scheme of her own. After this long dripping and oozing from every pore, she began to respire again more healthily than ever. So, with a vigorous shove, we launched our boats from the bank, while the flags and bulrushes curtsied a Godspeed and dropped silently down the stream. Any man striving to write like that will find his work cut out for him. It illustrates well enough his own passage on style in the same book, which runs, "The ready reader seizes the pen and shouts forward, Alamo and Fanning, and after rolls the tide of war. The walls and fences seem to travel,
but the most rapid trot is no flow after all, and thither, reader, you and I at least will not follow. Christ, Nietzsche, and Thoreau. To me, there are evidences galore that, were it possible for the three to meet, the founder of Christianity, Nietzsche, and Henry David Thoreau would stand foursquare, each understanding the other and finding themselves in a majority of questions in substantial agreement. With this, the narrow-minded sectarian would not agree, but it matters very little. Still, the Nazarene man, who said that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath, who seemed to have little or no use for mere professors of religion, would hardly enjoy this. I was once reproved by a minister who was driving a poor beast to some meeting-house horse sheds among the hills of New Hampshire, because I was bending my steps to a mountain top on the Sabbath instead of a church, when I could have gone further than he to hear a true word spoken on that or any other day. He declared that I was breaking the Lord's fourth commandment, and proceeded to enumerate in a sepulchral tone the disasters which had befallen him whenever he had done any ordinary work on the Sabbath. He really thought that a God was at work to tip up those who followed any secular work on this day, and did not see that it was the evil conscience of the workers that did it. The country is full of this superstition, so that when one enters a village, the church, not only really, but from association, is the ugliest looking building in it, because it is the one in which human nature stoops the lowest and is most disgraced. Certainly, such temples as these shall here long cease to deform the landscape. If I should ask the minister of Middlesex to let me speak in his pulpit on a Sunday, he would object, because I do not pray as he does, or because I am not ordained. What under the sun are these things? Really, there is no infidelity nowadays so great as that which prays and keeps the Sabbath and rebuilds churches. The sealer of the South Pacific preaches a true doctrine. The church is a sort of hospital for men's souls, and as full of quackery as the hospital for their bodies. Those who are taken into it live like pensioners in their retreat or sailors' snug harbor, where you may see a row of religious cripples sitting outside in sunny weather. Let not the apprehension that he may one day occupy a ward therein discourage the cheerful labors of the able-souled man. While he remembers the sick in their extremities, let him not look thither as to his goal. One is sick at heart of this pagoda worship. It is like the beating of gongs in a Hindu subterranean temple. In the dark places and dungeons, the preacher's words might perhaps strike root and grow, not in broad daylight and in any part of the world that I know. The sound of the Sabbath bell far away, now breaking on these shores, does not awaken pleasing associations, but melancholy and somber ones rather. One involuntarily rests on his oar to humor his unusually meditative mood. It is as the sound of many catechisms and religious books twanging and canting peal round the earth. Thoreau had true religion. Thoreau, in fact, had that true religion which makes a man feel and know that the world is good, and therefore for him were quite useless those reasoned arguments designed to convert the pessimist. With the things around and about him, he had a spiritual affinity. Everywhere he saw expressed life, warmth, freshness. Regarding the world disinterestedly, he found it beautiful, a place well worth while. For him, creeds were therefore absurdities. A man's faith is never contained in his creed, nor is his creed an article of his faith. The last is never adopted. This it is that permits him to smile ever and to live even as bravely as he does. And yet he clings anxiously to his creed as to a straw, thinking that that does him service because his sheet anchor does not drag. In most men's religion, the literature, which should be its umbilical cord connecting them with divinity, is rather like that thread which the accomplices of Cylon held in their hands when they went abroad from the temple of Minerva, the other end being attached to the statue of the goddess. But frequently, as in their case, the thread breaks, being stretched, and they are left without an asylum. The thread breaks, being stretched. That is indeed a noteworthy passage. One remembers the epoch of St. Augustine, or with a glance about us today, when what passes as Christianity is too often but a mere counsel of perfection, a thread stretched to the breaking point, with moral and physical confusion all about us, with old governments in perilous state, with spiritual corruption and moral paralysis on all sides, thoughtful men know that what is called religion is not religion, is indeed but an outward husk of the thing itself. It is to them that Thoreau appeals. There is perfect understanding between such men and Thoreau, for today it is as it was then, and there is a label of nostrums, and there is no lack of frantic voices calling upon us to enter 100 different heavens by 1,000 different gates. Reading his record of the week on the Concord is like journeying with an outspoken comrade. There are, of course, references in plenty to the scenery, and tales of the different places passed are told. But Thoreau is no chatterer like the man with a megaphone on a sightseeing car who is equally fortissimo in calling attention to cast iron memorial monument or a marble cathedral. There is in him no detestable patronage towards the scenery. Instead, you have a fellow traveler thinking aloud. You have a man thinking logically, fearlessly. You are getting real inside information. If the mood seizes him to talk about tramps or education or religion or success, he says what he has to say, though Mount Everest itself be passed without comment. The Week on the Concord. I picked up the book The Week on the Concord and it opened at page 55. It is one of those books which can be opened anywhere with a feeling of security that something of interest will meet the eye. My eye fell on the passage telling that the canoe, to avoid the 𝙁𝙬𝙬𝙀 falls, is steered into the canal, the day being Sunday. So they pass under a bridge near Chelmsford and note some young men lounging upon a bridge. At that a key note is struck. Your average diarist would fill pages with second-hand information about the town, information that could be gleaned with ease by means of a letter of inquiry sent to the local passenger agent. Not so Thoreau. It is the man that counts. There are young fellows with a whole day of leisure before them, but they have no use for their time. They leaned impudently over the rails to pry into our concerns, but we caught the eye of the most forward and looked at him until he was visibly discomfited. Not that there was any peculiar efficacy in our look, but rather a sense of shame left in him which disarmed him. And a little further on, as we passed under the last bridge of the canal, just before reaching the Merrimack, the people coming out of church paused to look at us from above, and apparently so strong is custom, indulged in some heathenish comparisons. But we are the truest observers of this sunny day. This is the leitmotif, the keynote. A vista is opened up and there is genial discourse on religion, conventionality, authority, and respectability. He is all for simplicity. He is all against becoming involved in anthropomorphic theology. Most people with whom I talk, he says, men and women even of some originality and genius, have their scheme of the universe all cut and dried. Very dry, I assure you, dry enough to burn, dry-rotted in powder post, methinks, which they have set up between you and them in the shortest intercourse. An ancient and tottering frame with all its boards blown off. They do not walk without their beds. Some to me seemingly very unimportant and unsubstantial things and relations are for them everlastingly settled as Father, Son, and Holy Ghost and the like. These are like the everlasting hills to them. But in all my wanderings I never came across the least vestige of authority for these things. They have not left so distinct a trace as the delicate flower of a remote geological period on the coal in my grate. The wisest man preaches no doctrines. He has no scheme. He sees no rafter, not even a cobweb against the heavens. It is clear sky. Tell me of the height of the mountains of the moon, or the diameter of space, and I may believe you, but of the secret history of the Almighty, and I shall pronounce thee mad. Yet we have a sort of family history of our God. So have the Tahitians of theirs, and some old poet's grand imagination is imposed upon us as adamantine everlasting truth and God's own word. His religious viewpoint summed up. So, as it seems to me, one may sum up Thoreau's viewpoint thus. Religion consists not in answering certain questions, but in making men of a certain quality. Mark this again. Notwithstanding the universal favor with which the New Testament is outwardly received, and even the bigotry with which it is defended, there is no hospitality shown to, there is no appreciation of, the order of truth with which it deals. I know of no book that has so few readers. There is none so truly strange and heretical and unpopular. To Christians, no less than Greeks and Jews, it is foolishness and a stumbling block. There are, indeed, severe things in it no man should read aloud but once. Seek first the kingdom of heaven. Lay not up for yourselves treasures on earth. If thou wilt be perfect, go and sell that thou hast, and give to the poor, and thou shalt have treasure in heaven. For what is a man profited, if he shall gain the whole world, and lose his own soul? Or what shall a man give in exchange for his soul? Think of this, Yankees. Verily I say unto you, if ye have faith as a grain of mustard seed, ye shall say unto this mountain, Remove hence to yonder place, and it shall remove, and nothing shall be impossible unto you. Think of repeating these things to a New England audience. Thirdly, fourthly, 15thly, till there are 3 barrels of sermons. Who, without cant, can read them aloud? Who, without cant, can hear them and not go out of the meeting house? They never were read. They never were heard. Let but one of these sentences be rightly read from any pulpit in the land, and there would not be left one stone of that meeting house upon another. His idea of good books. A few pages further on comes this. Books, not which afford us a cowering enjoyment, but in which each thought is of unusual daring, such as an idle man cannot read, and a timid one would not be entertained by, which even make us dangerous to existing institutions. Such I call good books, which is enough to damn him in the eyes of every Dr. Pangloss from Maine to California, not to mention all those self-appointed custodians of the public morals who see evil because it hangs like a film before their own eyes. 2 things must be plain by this time. In the first place, it is seen that Thoreau's feeling is for life itself, as opposed to life at second hand, to the mere telling about life. In his earnestness to touch things, to see things, instead of hearing the views of others who have seen and touched, he is blood brother to Richard Jefferies. Like him, he is capable of rare appreciation, of rare intensities. He builds his philosophy from the ground up, as does Cunningham Graham or W.H. Hudson, or as did old Isaac Walton and Gilbert. In the second place, while he may travel, his adventures are all adventures of the soul. The mere change of location is as nothing, affects nothing, means nothing, because wherever you are, the same fellow is with you. To say, here I am in Munich, or on such a day I set my foot on the rock from which Hennepin first saw Niagara, is to say nothing, but to set down a thought, as for instance, should a rattling busybody interfere in your meditations, to write, I find that I have a profound dislike of being interfered with, and to follow that thought through all its intricacies means everything. For assuredly any man can change his place, his latitude and longitude, but not many can decide that it is of prime import that each individual shall develop quietly according to his own capacity and condition. And such an attitude results in the Nietzschean philosophy finally, that the individual shall so train himself that he is capable of responsibility, shall be able to attend alone and determine his conduct by his own personal approvals and disapprovals. You will look in vain, then, for any startling adventures of the body, whether you read of his journey to Minnesota, his expedition to the White Mountains of New Hampshire, his excursion to the Maine woods, of his week's walking tour in Canada. He is no chameleon to change his color with his environment, no swiftly changing adapter to a new environment. His only romantic adventure. His only romantic adventure is passed over lightly. It was about the time of the visit to Cape Cod. The Provincetown Bank having been robbed, the suspicion of the police fell upon him and his companion, and their journey was traced day by officials. Again, at Wellfleet, Thoreau and his companion visited the hut of an aged oysterman whose idiot son expressed a determination to get a gun and shoot the damned book peddlers, all the time talking about books. As to his gift of description, I do not see how I could better illustrate what he can do at times than by quoting his impression of the Church of Notre Dame in Montreal. It appeared in Putnam's Magazine, 1853. It was a great cave in the midst of a city. And what were the altars and the tinsel but the sparkling stalactites, into which you entered in a moment, and where the still atmosphere and the somber light disposed to serious and profitable thought. Such a cave at hand, which you may enter any day, is worth 1,000 of our churches, which are open only Sundays, hardly long enough for an airing, and then filled with bustling congregation. A church where the priest is the least part, where you do your own preaching, where the universe preaches to you and you can be heard. In Concord, to be sure, we do not need much. Our forests are such a church, far grander and more sacred. I think of its value not only to religion, but to philosophy and to poetry. Besides a reading room, to have a thinking room in every city. Perchance the time will come when every house will have not only its sleeping rooms and dining room and talking room or parlor, but its thinking room also, and the architects will put it in their plans. Let it be furnished and ornamented with whatever conduces to serious and creative thought. I should not object to the holy water if it were consecrated by the imagination of the worshippers. A splendid descriptive passage. The second splendidly descriptive passage of the solitude of the Maine forests is taken from the essay on Katahdin and the Maine woods, which appeared in the Union magazine in 1848. Here it is. Perhaps I most fully realized that this was primeval, untamed, and forever untamable nature, or whatever else men call it, while coming down this part of the mountain. We were passing over burnt lands, burnt by lightning, perchance, though they showed no recent marks of fire, hardly so much as a charred stump, but looked rather like a natural pasture for the moose and deer, exceedingly wild and desolate, with occasional strips of timber crossing them, and low poplars springing up and patches of blueberries here and there. I found myself traversing them familiarly, like some pasture run to waste or partially reduced by man. But when I reflected what man, what brother or sister or kinsman of our race made it and claimed it, I expected the proprietor to rise up and dispute my passage. It is difficult to conceive of a region uninhabited by man. We habitually presume his presence and influence everywhere, and yet we have not seen pure nature, unless we have seen her thus vast and drear and inhuman, though in the midst of cities. What is most striking in the Maine wilderness is the continuousness of the forest, with fewer open intervals or glades than you had imagined. Except the few burnt lands, the narrow intervals on the rivers, the bare tops of the high mountains, and the lakes and streams, the forest is uninterrupted. It is even more grim and wild than you had anticipated, a damp and intricate wilderness, in the spring everywhere wet and miry. Who shall describe the inexpressible tenderness and immortal life of the grim forest, where nature, though it be midwinter, is ever in her spring, where the most grown and decaying trees are not old, but seem to enjoy perpetual youth, and blissful, innocent nature, like a serene infant, is too happy to make a noise, except by a few tinkling, lisping birds and trickling rills. I am moved to quote two other passages. In that which next follows, it is plain to be seen that the man had a quick eye, an eye that took in everything. Dickens himself has done no better. It is a picture of a bright, breezy day on the Concord. Many waves are there agitated by the wind, keeping nature fresh, the spray blowing in your face, reeds and rushes waving, ducks by the hundred, all uneasy in the surf, in the raw wind, just ready to rise, and now going off with a clatter and a whistling like riggers straight from Labrador, flying against the stiff gale with reefed wings, or else circling round first with all their paddles briskly moving just over the surf to reconnoitre you before they leave these parts. Gulls wheeling overhead, muskrats swimming for dear life, wet and cold, with no fire to warm them by that you know of, their labored homes rising here and there like haystacks, and countless mice and moles and winged titmice along the sunny shore, cranberries tossed on the waves and heaving up on the beach, their little red skiffs beating about among the alders, such healthy, natural tumult as proves the last day is not yet at hand. And there stand all around the alders and birches and oaks and maples, full of glee and sap, holding in their buds until the waters subside. It is easy to be seen that there is ecstasy there. The man has seen the thing and is carried away with it. To match it, I have to go to the 36th chapter of Martin Chuzzlewit and read the immortal passage which tells that Tom Pitch is come to town. Seeing straight. After all said and done, probably with the exception of accidents, most men have similar experiences. Some here and there have been able to break through the web that enmeshes most of us. By strength or by daring, they have faced facts, seen the illusions of life, and escaped much. The vast majority of men accept dumbly and unquestioningly all the outer coverings, as it were, that the world hands them. They writhe perhaps under the sweltering load, but do not even guess it to be possible to shake off the hampering bonds and stand free. They do not even dare to think that life as it is lived is otherwise than perfect. They lie to the world and they lie to themselves. They can no more break loose from the witcheries imposed upon them by convention, custom, creed, that could Merlin free himself from the prison of air woven by Vivian. They do not even suspect that the seductions of customs, society, persons, stimulate all that is lowest, and call forth nothing that is highest in either intellect or character. That in the recesses of his heart the most unthinking of men regards his life with dissatisfaction is a fact. Even that most sacred of institutions, the home, he views with veiled suspicion, and is glad enough to find an excuse, no matter how paltry, to escape its bondage. From something of this comes the immense popularity of lodges in this country of ours, for the lodge offers a decent excuse to escape for a couple of hours the boredom of home. But man, being given to lying and self-deception, will not admit that to be the case. Instead, driven to bay, he will indulge in high sentiments of brotherhood, the fellowship, and charity. I have not found, filling the benches and chairs in secret fraternal halls, men of a serious bent, book lovers, men of ideals, men of large action. Neither are the majority of lodge men of lively age. Looking at the faces of my fellow lodgemen, I have seen that they were indeed the faces of men who had leaped from one desperation to another. The everlasting ennui of home had been too much for them. For a similar reason, the 𝙃𝙚𝙘𝙖𝙀 spellbinder comes as godsend to the women. She finds in the platitudinous utterances and the dull ineptitudes of the lecturer a slight relief from the distressing vacuity of home. As for the second sacred institution, the sanctity of married life, it is not necessary to look very far to discover a kind of hidden condemnation of it as a state of bliss. The condemnation is, to be sure, distorted, as it were. Still, it is only necessary to mark the eagerness with which men turn to the newspaper reports of a thaw case or an Arbuckle affair, or crowd the doors of a theater when a triangle comedy is on the boards, or lend ear to bawdy tales in the smoking car or hotel lobby, to come to the conclusion that the marriage state is popularly held to be a state of bondage. When I say the marriage state, I mean more particularly just now our unfortunate habit of locking two in indissoluble bonds and forbidding either of the contracting parties to have the companionship or friendship of any of the opposite sex. The married man who has other friends besides his wife need not necessarily be a lascivious scoundrel, a filthy wretch and a scoundrel, nor need a wife be a Messalina because she finds qualities of friendship and understanding in the man who is not her husband. Naturally, a woman whose sphere is closely limited to the home must of necessity become a creature full of exasperating trivialities. She, then, must compare unfavorably in the eyes of the man of business with those he meets in the daily walk, with the result that the man must find the home a far less attractive place than the business house. It is, then, no exaggeration at all when Thoreau writes that most men lead lives of quiet desperation. They do and they must, so long as they are no intellectual pursuits and no ideal. The real difficulty comes in that men refuse to take stock of themselves, or taking stock, decline to be guided by the result. But once get a sincere stock-taker, to use the Thoreau phrase, and you must of necessity have a rebel. He must revolt at the number, the character, and the intensity of the lies he has been fathering. If he does not revolt, it is because he is fettered by self-interest or timidity. Of course, it is not to be overlooked that, as things are, there are many men whose brains are, in a very real sense, atrophied from disuse. They are incapable of grasping the most elementary truth. If you consider the child, generally speaking, progresses alone and unaided, and with remarkable results up to the age at which it is sent to school. In that 6 years it makes 7 leagued strides. It learns not only to walk and to play and to exercise its limbs, but also to talk, to read, to think. For 6 years it is a busy creature, ever inquiring, ever fresh, ever learning. Then comes school. Immediately authority is substituted for independent verification. It is the word of the teacher against the child's own reason. Education, in its real meaning, ceases when school begins. Once at school, the fetters are fast fixed. On every side, authority presses. The growing boy is cribbed and confined. Even petty convention rules him most absurdly. He must wear what other boys wear and must do what other boys do. He dare not play marbles, for instance, when marbles are out. He may think a certain way, but that way will be hidden when he learns, as he soon does, that it is expected to say not what he thinks, but what it is desirable that he should say, lest he incur the teacher's displeasure. He also learns, most bitter lesson, that in this republic of ours, rewards are not as commensurate with deeds as with wealth, and that the banker's son makes good grades with far more ease than the son of the washwoman in the town. Evidently, then, the growing brain cannot function as freely between the ages of 7 and 14 as it did up to 7. Should the growing lad leave school and enter the world of work about this time, he takes, not by any means the work for which he is best adapted, or for which he has inclination, but the first job that turns up. Your potential Keats may earn his daily bread standing at the throttle of a soda fountain, or your Beethoven may be boy helper in a boiler factory. It is utter nonsense to say that the man will rise in spite of his circumstances. No seed can fructify except it fall on ground that will nourish. But let that pass. The fact is that your lad going to work finds that his initiative is not welcomed. He is expected to do as he is told. "I'll do the thinking," says the boss. "You're paid to work." So there is a further period when the brain does not function, another time of arrested development. Again, while the authority of the teacher ceases, it does not follow that there is a rejuvenation of mental activity. The growing youth comes early under the influence of the press. The self-appointed molder of public opinion gets in his work. The modern newspaper, which panders to the lower intellectual instincts and to the lower social and moral instincts of its readers, is thrust upon the man morning and evening. Propaganda finds in the newspaper a ready and willing tool, and editors darken counsel by words without meaning. So there is still no hope. The brain that functioned so actively for the first 6 or 7 years is now slow and sluggish. If there remains dormant in the youth a passion for knowledge, there are no means by which he can satisfy it. Books are rare and Carnegie libraries ill-furnished far too often. Publishers flood the market with cheap novels and things put forth to make a sensation. Man is not a thinking animal. But why go on? The fact of the matter is that man is in so vicious a circle that he not only does not use his brain, but actually cannot use it because it is, by years of disuse, partially atrophied. If this is an idea difficult to grasp, take the analogy of a child which had used its right arm up to the age of 6, then had it bound to its side until the age of 30. A nation of men thus bound would find a free-armed man a wonderful being. So we, who have not dared to think, who have submitted to the bonds of prejudice and convention, regard a Thoreau, a Shelley, a Carlyle, a Ruskin with awe and wonderment, to find, on reading them, that they have done little more than to express the thoughts which each and every one of us have been dimly conscious, but have been unable or unwilling to express. Thoreau, an intellectual rebel. Thoreau himself seems to have been an intellectual rebel from the first. He was ever against sham religion, sham propriety, sham knowledge. The bare facts of his life are significant. He was of Scotch-French descent, and his father was a Boston merchant who went bankrupt and sold his gold ring to pay the last of his creditors. The intelligent decency of the man who gently reproved Henry because he took time from his studies to make, rather than to buy, maple sugar, though he was assured that the knowledge thus gained was commensurate with university training, is to be remembered. It is good to compare that story with the passage from Walden in which Thoreau, speaking of education, says, "To my astonishment, I was informed on leaving college that I had studied navigation. Why, if I had taken one turn down the harbor, I should have known more about it." Henry David was one of 4 children, 2 of which were girls. Of his childhood days, the books of biography tell many things, but it does not appear that he was more remarkable than any other lively lad. He seems to have avoided school as much as he dared. Those hours that should have been devoted to study have been spent in scouring the woods and exploring the lakes and streams of my native village. Obviously, he was keenly interested in nature study. In spite of his negligence in school, and also in spite of the financial circumstances of the family, it was decided to send him to Harvard. Again, his biographers are prolix in some cases, ardently apologetic in others. The highlights are that he did a great amount of reading at college, and we have his own word for it that the library was the only part of his college training which gave him lasting good. There is, too, a story that Thoreau at Harvard always wore a dark green coat because the college authorities recommended black. Leaving college, he taught school for a short time but resigned his position rather than inflict corporal punishment. Then followed another period of teaching in a private school, abandoned in 1841 when he accepted an invitation to become one of the Emerson household. Emerson found inspiration in the young naturalist, and while there, Thoreau became filled with an ambition to devote his life to writing. There was a trip to New York, a few articles written for magazines, and the brief record of his return to Concord appears in his diary thus: made pencils in 1844, Texas House to August 29, 1850. Texas House was the family residence. At his trade of pencil maker, he manufactured, he tells us, $1,000 worth of pencils in a year, selling them wholesale to pay a debt of $100. The debt had been located as having been due to Monroe, the Boston publisher, who in 1849 brought out his book, The Week on the Concord and Merrimack. The publication was a flat failure, although the book received favorable reviews. 700 copies were returned to Thoreau unsold, and he carried them to his attic study on his own back, recording grimly that in his library there were nearly 900 volumes, 700 of which I wrote myself. Was wholeheartedly anti-slavery. When the Harper's Ferry affair occurred, Thoreau threw himself wholeheartedly into the cause against slavery. His outspoken boldness astonished and alarmed his friends. His arrest for utterances which today would be called anarchistic was expected, but he felt that he had a message which had to be given to the world. Like a clarion rang his prophetic words: prepare yourself for a settlement of that question that must come up for settlement sooner than you are prepared for it. You may dispose of me very easily, I am nearly disposed of now, but this question is still to be settled. This Negro question, I mean. The end of that is not yet. The ravages of pulmonary tuberculosis, a disease of which other members of the family had died, were upon him about this time. His biographers make much of the fact that he bore his fate stoically, he was uncomplaining in his sickness, and so on, all of which would have made a man of Thoreau's make-up scornful, if not furious. For, as he himself would have pointed out, the disease is not one to cause despondency, and is certainly not a painful one. Nor is it proper to make much of the fact that Thoreau met death without fear. Doubtless, most men do. He died May 6, 1862. Of that last scene, it seems to me that the most noteworthy thing is his swift reply to Parker Pillsbury, who, narrow Calvinist as he was, asked Thoreau what he had to say about the perspective hereafter. "My friend, one world at a time," was the answer. Again, being asked if he had made his peace with God, Thoreau whimsically answered, "I have never quarreled with him."